Have you ever felt absolutely certain about something, only to discover you were completely wrong? Have you ever felt absolutely certain about something, only to discover you were completely wrong? Or perhaps you've made a decision that, in hindsight, seems utterly irrational, yet at the time, it felt like the only logical choice. What if I told you that your own brain, that magnificent organ responsible for your thoughts, memories, and perceptions, is constantly playing tricks on you? It's not malicious, but it's a prediction machine, wired for survival in an ancient world, often ill-equipped for the complexities of modern life. These mental shortcuts, or cognitive biases, are invisible forces shaping your reality, influencing your decisions, and sometimes, leading you astray without you even realizing it. Today, we're diving deep into 7 profound ways your brain lies to you every single day, exploring the science behind these deceptions, uncovering real-world examples, and most importantly, equipping you with the tools to see through the illusion and reclaim control over your thoughts and choices. Get ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about how you think. First on our list of brain trickery is the Dunning-Kruger Effect, a cognitive bias that highlights a truly unsettling paradox. The less competent someone is in a particular area, the more likely they are to overestimate their own ability. This phenomenon was famously identified in a 1999 study by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger. They tested participants on various skills, including humor, grammar, and logical reasoning, and then asked them to estimate their performance relative to others. What they found was astonishing. Individuals who scored in the bottom quartile, meaning they were among the least skilled, consistently overestimated their abilities, often believing they performed better than the majority. Conversely, highly competent individuals tended to underestimate their relative skill, though not as dramatically. The core insight here is that incompetence not only leads to poor performance but also robs individuals of the metacognitive ability to recognize their own shortcomings. To put it simply, you need a certain level of skill to even recognize what good skill looks like, and if you lack that foundational knowledge, you can't accurately assess your own deficiencies. In the real world, the Dunning-Kruger effect manifests in countless ways. Think of the amateur chef who believes their cooking is gourmet level, despite consistently burning meals, or the new employee who, after a few months, confidently asserts they understand the entire business better than seasoned veterans. We see it in online forums where individuals with minimal expertise passionately debate complex scientific topics, convinced of their superior understanding. The danger of this bias is not just personal delusion. It can lead to disastrous decisions in professional settings, as overconfident but underskilled individuals take on tasks beyond their capabilities, often with severe consequences. So, how do we combat this insidious self-deception? The key lies in cultivating genuine self-awareness and a commitment to continuous learning. Actively seek out constructive criticism, not just praise. Embrace a beginner's mindset, acknowledging that there is always more to learn, regardless of your experience level. Engage in deliberate practice and regularly test your knowledge against objective standards. Perhaps most importantly, surround yourself with people who are willing to challenge your assumptions and provide honest feedback. True expertise often comes with a healthy dose of humility, a recognition of the vastness of what you don't know. By actively seeking to identify and fill the gaps in your knowledge, you can begin to bridge the chasm between perceived and actual competence. Next, let's confront a bias that keeps us trapped in failing ventures: the sunk cost fallacy. This is the irrational tendency to continue investing in an endeavor simply because we've already poured significant time, money, or effort into it, even when continuing is clearly against our best interests. The core of this deception is our aversion to loss. We feel the pain of past investments more acutely than the potential benefits of cutting our losses and moving on. The term itself gained prominence partly due to the Concorde supersonic jet project. Despite becoming clear that the plane was not profitable, the British and French governments continued to fund it for decades, unwilling to abandon the billions already invested. This is a classic example of throwing good money after bad. In a logical world, past, unrecoverable costs, sunk costs should have no bearing on future decisions. Yet, our brains trick us into believing that if we just invest a little more, we can somehow salvage what's already gone. Consider the common scenario of watching a terrible movie. You've paid for the ticket, you're 30 minutes in, and it's agonizing. A rational person would leave and reclaim their time. But many of us stay, enduring the pain, because we've already invested the ticket price and those initial 30 minutes. The same applies to business projects that are clearly failing, relationships that are toxic, or even careers that bring no joy. We cling to them, not because they offer future promise, but because of the sheer weight of our past commitment. This bias is fueled by several psychological factors: loss aversion, the desire to avoid appearing wasteful, and a sense of personal responsibility for our initial decisions. To overcome the sunk cost fallacy, we must cultivate the ability to detach from our past investments. When making a decision, consciously ask yourself, if I hadn't already invested anything, would I still choose this path today? Focus solely on the future costs and benefits, not on what's already been expended. Recognize that the money, time, or effort is already gone, regardless of your next move. The only thing you can control is whether you continue to waste more resources. It requires courage to admit a past decision was flawed and to pivot, but true wisdom lies in knowing when to cut your losses and redirect your energy towards more fruitful endeavors. Our third cognitive pitfall is the availability heuristic, a mental shortcut where we judge the likelihood or frequency of an event based on how easily examples or instances come to mind. If something is vivid, recent, or emotionally charged, our brains tend to overestimate its prevalence, leading us to make decisions based on readily available, but not necessarily representative, information. This bias was famously described by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Think about how we perceive risk. After a highly publicized plane crash, many people become fearful of flying, even though statistically, air travel remains one of the safest forms of transportation. The vivid images and news reports make the idea of a plane crash highly available in our minds, causing us to overestimate its actual probability. Meanwhile, the far more common dangers of driving, which rarely make sensational headlines, are underestimated. Similarly, if you constantly hear about successful entrepreneurs, you might overestimate your own chances of striking it rich, overlooking the countless failures that don't get media attention. The availability heuristic is also at play when we make judgments about entire groups of people based on a few memorable, often negative, interactions or stereotypes. These easily recalled instances overshadow the broader, more nuanced reality. To counter the availability heuristic, we need to consciously challenge our initial, gut-level assessments. Don't just rely on what immediately comes to mind. Instead, actively seek out objective data and statistics. When faced with a decision, ask yourself, am I basing this on actual probabilities, or on the most dramatic or recent examples I can recall? Consider a wider range of evidence, not just the most salient. By deliberately seeking out less accessible information and forcing ourselves to consider alternative scenarios, we can move beyond the vivid but often misleading narratives our brains construct and make more informed, rational judgments. Our fourth brain deception is the halo effect, a cognitive bias where our overall impression of a person, company, or product in one area influences our feelings and thoughts about their other, unrelated traits. Essentially, a single positive characteristic creates a halo of positivity that spills over, making us perceive everything else about them in a favorable light, even if there's no objective evidence to support it. This phenomenon was first identified by psychologist Edward Thorndike in the early 20th century. He observed that commanding officers would rate their soldiers highly across all traits, such as intelligence, leadership, and physical qualities, simply because they had a positive impression of one particular trait, like neatness. In modern life, the halo effect is rampant. Think about celebrity endorsements. A famous actor, admired for their on-screen charisma, might promote a product they know little about, yet their endorsement lends an undeserved credibility to the product. We assume that because they are good at acting, they must also be knowledgeable about skincare or financial investments. In the workplace, an employee who is exceptionally punctual might be perceived as more competent, intelligent, and hardworking, even if their actual output doesn't always reflect those qualities. Conversely, the horn effect is the negative counterpart, where a single negative trait casts a shadow over all other perceptions. Someone who is perceived as rude might also be unfairly judged as unintelligent or lazy. The danger of the halo effect lies in its ability to cloud our judgment, leading to biased hiring decisions, unfair performance reviews, and irrational consumer choices. We stop evaluating individuals or products on their individual merits and instead rely on a superficial, generalized impression. To combat the halo effect, we must consciously slow down our evaluations and adopt a more systematic approach. Instead of forming an immediate overall impression, try to assess each trait or characteristic independently. In hiring, for example, use structured interviews and rubrics to evaluate candidates against specific criteria, rather than letting a charming personality or impressive resume overshadow other important qualifications. When making purchasing decisions, research products thoroughly and compare features objectively, rather than being swayed by attractive packaging or a single positive review. By dissecting our perceptions and scrutinizing each attribute separately, we can break free from the magnetic pull of the halo and make more accurate, equitable judgments. Our fifth cognitive distortion is the anchoring bias, a powerful mental shortcut where we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we encounter, the anchor, when making decisions. This initial piece of data, even if irrelevant or arbitrary, disproportionately influences our subsequent judgments and estimations. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman famously demonstrated this in a 1974 study. They asked participants to estimate the percentage of African countries in the United Nations. Before giving their estimate, participants watched a wheel of fortune spin, which was rigged to land on either 10 or 65. Those who saw the wheel land on 10 gave significantly lower estimates for the percentage of African countries than those who saw it land on 65. The random number, the anchor, profoundly skewed their judgment. In everyday life, anchoring bias is pervasive, especially in negotiations and pricing. Think about buying a car. The initial price quoted by the salesperson, even if inflated, sets an anchor in your mind. Subsequent offers or counter-offers are then evaluated relative to that initial high number, making a slightly lower price seem like a great deal, even if it's still above the car's true market value. Similarly, in salary negotiations, the first number mentioned often dictates the entire discussion. If you, as a job candidate, state a high salary expectation first, you set a high anchor, potentially leading to a better final offer than if the employer had set a lower anchor. This bias also affects our perception of value. A product initially priced very high, then discounted, often appears more valuable than a product consistently priced lower, even if they are identical. The original high price acts as an anchor, making the discounted price seem like a bargain. To overcome anchoring bias, we must consciously challenge the first piece of information presented. Before entering a negotiation or making a significant purchase, do your own independent research to establish a realistic range of values. Don't let the first number you hear dictate your entire thought process. Actively consider multiple perspectives and data points, rather than fixating on the initial anchor. When presented with an anchor, deliberately generate counter-anchors or alternative starting points to broaden your perspective. By actively questioning and deconstructing the influence of initial information, we can make decisions based on a more objective assessment of value and reality, rather than being tethered to an arbitrary starting point. Our sixth cognitive bias, the planning fallacy, is a pervasive tendency to underestimate the time, costs, and risks required to complete future tasks, even when we have a history of similar tasks taking longer than expected. It's an optimistic prediction bias, where we believe that this time, things will be different, and everything will go smoothly. This bias was first identified by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who observed that people consistently underestimate how long it will take them to finish projects. A classic example is the construction of the Sydney Opera House. Initially estimated to be completed in 4 years at a cost of around $7 million, it ultimately took 14 years and over $100 million to finish. The planners, despite likely having experience with other complex projects, fell victim to an overly optimistic internal view. We see the planning fallacy in our daily lives constantly. Think about that home renovation project you started, convinced it would be done in a weekend, only to find yourself still working on it weeks later. Or the student who believes they can write an entire research paper the night before it's due, despite past experiences proving otherwise. This isn't necessarily a sign of laziness, it's a deeply ingrained cognitive bias fueled by optimism and a focus on the best-case scenario, often ignoring potential obstacles and unforeseen complications. The planning fallacy is particularly dangerous in professional settings, leading to missed deadlines, budget overruns, and increased stress. To mitigate the planning fallacy, we need to shift from an inside view to an outside view. Instead of focusing solely on the unique details of the current task, consider similar projects you or others have undertaken in the past. What were the actual completion times and costs? Use this historical data as a more realistic baseline. Actively identify potential roadblocks and build in buffer time for unexpected delays. Break down large tasks into smaller, more manageable sub-tasks, and estimate each one individually. Seek objective feedback from others who have experience with similar projects, as they are less likely to be swayed by your personal optimism. By embracing a more realistic, data-driven approach to planning, we can escape the illusion of effortless completion and set ourselves up for greater success. Finally, we arrive at the spotlight effect, a fascinating cognitive bias that makes us believe we are noticed and scrutinized far more than we actually are. It's the feeling that a metaphorical spotlight is constantly shining on us, highlighting our every action, mistake, or perceived flaw, when in reality, most people are too preoccupied with their own lives to pay much attention. This egocentric bias was famously demonstrated in a study by Thomas Gilovich, Victoria Medvik, and Kenneth Savitsky. In one experiment, participants were asked to wear an embarrassing t-shirt, featuring a picture of Barry Manilow, before entering a room with other students. They were then asked to estimate how many of the other students would notice their shirt. The participants consistently overestimated the number of observers, often by a significant margin. In reality, far fewer people noticed the shirt than the wearers anticipated. The spotlight effect manifests in countless everyday situations. Have you ever stumbled in public and felt a wave of mortification, convinced that everyone saw your clumsy moment? Or perhaps you've had a bad hair day and felt intensely self-conscious, assuming every person you encountered was fixated on your hair. We often agonize over minor social blunders, believing they will be remembered and replayed by others, when in truth, most people barely register them, or quickly forget. This bias is fueled by our natural tendency to be the center of our own universe. Our thoughts, feelings, and experiences are paramount to us, so we mistakenly assume they are equally important to others. The illusion of transparency, a related concept, further exacerbates this, making us believe that our internal emotional states are far more obvious to others than they actually are. The danger of the spotlight effect is that it can lead to excessive self-consciousness, social anxiety, and a reluctance to take risks or express ourselves authentically. We might avoid speaking up in meetings, trying new things, or simply being ourselves, all out of an exaggerated fear of judgment. To overcome the spotlight effect, the first step is simply awareness. Recognize that your internal experience is not as transparent to others as you might think. Remind yourself that most people are primarily focused on their own concerns, not on your minor imperfections. When you feel that intense gaze, consciously shift your focus outward. Observe others, you'll likely find they are not paying nearly as much attention to you as you imagined. Practice self-compassion and humor. If you do make a mistake, acknowledge it, perhaps even with a lighthearted comment, and then move on. The more you internalize that your perceived flaws are often invisible to others, the more freedom you gain to live authentically and confidently, unburdened by the imaginary spotlight. So, we've journeyed through 7 profound ways our brains, in their attempt to simplify a complex world, can inadvertently mislead us. From the overconfidence of the Dunning-Kruger Effect to the stubborn grip of the sunk cost fallacy, the vivid deceptions of the availability heuristic, the unfair judgments of the halo effect, the sticky influence of anchoring bias, the optimistic delusion of the planning fallacy, and the exaggerated self-consciousness of the spotlight effect, each bias reveals a fundamental truth: our perception of reality is not always as objective as we believe. But here's the truly empowering part: simply understanding these biases is the first, most crucial step towards overcoming them. It's like learning the secret code to your own mind. Once you recognize the patterns of deception, you can begin to question your automatic thoughts, challenge your initial assumptions, and deliberately seek out alternative perspectives. This isn't about eradicating these biases entirely. They are deeply ingrained evolutionary shortcuts. Instead, it's about developing a metacognitive awareness, a higher-level thinking that allows you to observe your own thinking process. It's about pausing before you react, asking critical questions, and actively seeking disconfirming evidence. It's about cultivating intellectual humility, embracing curiosity, and committing to a lifelong journey of self-correction. The world around us is constantly vying for our attention, trying to influence our decisions, and often, exploiting these very biases. But by becoming more attuned to the subtle ways your brain can lie to you, you gain an incredible superpower: the ability to think more clearly, decide more wisely, and ultimately, live more authentically. The choice is yours: remain a passive recipient of your brain's deceptions, or become the active architect of your own understanding. What will you choose?